record button now. Go ahead, Ingmar. Sorry for the interruption.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, thanks for recording it. So just for the video, so I was just explaining what is meant by remote sensing and the traditional sensing. So here I was just showing a series of satellite images that sort of show a glacier melting. Or here's another example about for remote sensing, where you can sort of see deforestation in the Amazon, right? So the dark green is sort of healthy rainforest, and then the sort of light green is those are areas of sort of deforestation, right? And then sort of getting closer to the sort of human behavior. Here I'm showing a night light, right? Sort of also light that's being emitted at night and then captured by satellites, where you can sort of clearly see that there's not that much light being emitted from North Korea, which is typically is seen as a sign of both maybe not sufficient electrification, or generally a reduced sort of economic activity sort of compared to South Korea. So now I will sort of talk about remote social sensing, and by this I mean the acquisition of information about a society or social phenomenon, still without making contact with people, and thus is in contrast to on-site surveys, right? And so here satellites might also help to a degree, but I will, you could also think of sort of Google Trends or Twitter, but in this talk, I will talk about advertising data and how this can be used for remote social sensing. So so let's dive into sort of advertising data. I'm sure you've heard this slogan before, right? If you're not paying for the product, then you are the product, right? And so this means that all the sort of social network sites that you get to use for free, they collect a lot of information about you, right? And so this means this information is then sort of packaged up and sort of to create like a sort of profile for you, and then this profile with certain attributes can be sort of targeted by potential advertisers, right? And just to give you like a real example, on Facebook, I can launch an ad that's only shown to female Facebook users living in London, aged 25 to 29, who lived in Poland, and who use an iOS device. Okay, and that could be even more specific, but let's sort of stop there. And then the crucial thing for this talk is that before you launch your advertising campaign, and so also before you have to pay anything, Facebook provides so-called audience estimates, right? Sort of how many people in its sort of inventory match your targeting criteria, right? And so in this case, Facebook would provide you with an estimate of 2,600 so-called monthly active users, so who log in at least once a month, matching sort of your targeting criteria. And this estimate, right, this is sort of like a no-cost, real-time digital census, is provided for free, again, for free, to anybody with a Facebook account. Again, you don't need, any special sort of agreement with Facebook. You can just go through the steps of launching an advertising campaign, and you can collect this information, right? So you can sort of basically do like a real-time sort of census over the well over 2 billion Facebook users. And similarly also for other platforms such as LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram is part of Facebook, or Weibo in China. But in this talk, I will only talk about Facebook. Hopefully later in the Q&A, we can also talk about other platforms, right? So the question is, so how can we use this for remote social sensing? So first, let me try to make this, sort of as concrete as possible. So this is a screenshot of Facebook's advertising platform, where you can sort of see that I'm targeting people in a particular part of Doha. Right? It's not even all of Doha, right? It's just part of Doha. Ages 13 and above, only men, but not all men, only men who either lived in India or Nepal, and also who use Android devices. Why am I interested in the device type? As we'll also see later, so the device type is a proxy for wealth, put simply, right? So if you have an iOS device, or maybe even the latest iPhone, typically you have higher disposable income than if you are using Android devices. And again, I could be more specific and only look at sort of older Android devices. And then here, up here is what we are sort of referring to, this potential reach. This is the audience estimate that's of interest to us. So let me show you some data visualization that we've created around this to show you sort of what's possible with this data. So this data is not live. This was collected, I think, already 4.5 years ago, but just to illustrate what's sort of possible. So let me start with New York City, where suppose you wanted to understand the wealth distribution in New York City. Right? So then you could sort of look at where in New York City are Facebook users predominantly using iOS devices. You sort of see that in sort of Manhattan and Midtown, you have about 90% of Facebook users using iOS devices, but in the Bronx, this is only about sort of 40 to 50%, right? So you would sort of correctly assume that there's some sort of wealth differential between these two areas, right? But you can also look at countries somebody has lived in. So if I look at Facebook users who used to live in Latin America, where do they live now? And again, I see sort of in the Bronx and sort of neighboring areas, about sort of 40% or 30 to 40% of Facebook users match this criteria, right? Sort of suggesting that there's a large Latin American community here, right? And again, of course, here I'm not telling you anything you can't find through sort of, census data, but in other parts of the world, you don't have the same sort of open census data, right? And this includes sort of Doha, right? So for example, let me look at, let's look at people who used to live in Nepal. Sort of people who used to live in Nepal, they are predominantly found in the industrial area. So this is an area that was particularly built to house people from Southeast Asia. They're almost all men. They're fairly young, which is a blessing now during COVID times, right? Because the death rate is quite low because they're quite young, and they're almost all Android device users, right? Suggesting that probably they don't have a very high disposable income, right? And I can contrast this with other groups, for example, people who used to live in Western Europe or North America. They are more gender balanced, right? I can bring over my wife and family, and people, unfortunately, most people from Nepal cannot because there's a certain minimum income threshold you need for a family visa. The vast majority are university graduates. They're also older people, right? These are sort of the knowledge expats, and they're more iOS device users than Android device users, right? And we also live in a different part of town, right? So I'm actually right here at the moment, right? And again, you can do this also in sort of countries where maybe no or little official, sort of statistics are available. So I'm just showing Lagos here. Let's look again at the device type, for example, where you would sort of see that Lagos Island, this is where the government is located, has comparatively higher iOS usage of sort of like 14 to 15% of Facebook users, where sort of the rest of Lagos or the suburbs, it drops to maybe sort of 5%, right? And so again, you would rightly assume, or I think it's correct, that the government area sort of has higher as people with higher wealth residing there. So now let me go back to my slideshow. So hopefully this just showed you quite concretely the type of data that you can collect and what's possible with this data. And so now, what are we?
Mark, can I ask how
please.
Visualization was done? Is it by getting? Have you gotten specific places and done queries, or is this going in live?
Yeah, it's a good. It's not live. So for example, for this is all pre-computed sort of, right? So for example, for New York City, we would query for every zip code in this zip code, how many young women with an iOS device have a university degree and lived in Latin America, right? This would be one query, right? So you can see that there's a large number of requests that must be made to sort of construct this visualization, right? And so all of this is sort of done offline and then just sort of visualized, sort of. So similarly for the other location. No, thanks for the clarifying question. What are we trying to do with this, right? Other than just sort of put together some sort of fun visualizations or so, right? We're trying to use this data to fill data gaps related to international development, right? And so what's wrong with traditional data on sort of global development? Well, at least sort of three things, right? So one is the sort of the speed, right? So it's often linked to censuses that are done every 10 years, right? So now, or sort of last year or 2 years ago, most countries in the world had another sort of census round, but even then it takes another sort of 2 years often also for the data to be processed and available. Data is often is often spatially coarse. For example, you might have a data point for Uttar Pradesh, but Uttar Pradesh has 200 million people, right? I mean, that's more than Germany. I mean, more than twice, as much as sort of Germany. And you have sort of one data point, so it's essentially meaningless, right? And then also there are other sort of dimensions of disaggregation that are often missing, right? For example, gender. So that's a dimension that we are interested in, right? So what is gender-specific poverty look like, right? It might not be the same as overall poverty. And so, yeah, so we are basically trying to combine this sort of advertising data with other data sources to have more recent estimates, more spatially granular estimates, and more sort of demographically disaggregated estimates. And yeah, in the rest of my talk, so let me just sort of check time. Okay, so maybe in the next half an hour or so, I'll try to give you sort of 3 examples of spelling this out a bit more in detail on how you use this for monitoring international migration, to map poverty, and to track digital gender gaps. So let's start with the first example, which is something that we did with partners at UNHCR and UNICEF and IMAP, it's an NGO in the context of the Venezuelan exodus. So just for, sorry, I see a question. Yeah, if it's a clarification question, Pushkar, please interrupt.
Hi, Ingmar. Very nice and very interesting. I got a chance to work on this kind of like API also like a couple of years ago. So I have one question when you were quoting Uttar Pradesh example. I don't think like all of those people living there will use Facebook. So do you incorporate some kind of correction while incorporating?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I'll get to this sort of. So it's a good question. Absolutely, right. So and the whole sort of selection bias or is a crucial sort of challenge. So absolutely. So I will definitely address that. Happy to discuss that, but also more at the end. But yeah, those are the right sort of questions to ask sort of. So right, like sort of. So in some So it's thanks for this. I'll definitely get to that.
Sure.
So continuing with the example of with this sort of use case in Venezuela, sort of. So we did this work in 2018, 2019. When the annual inflation was 10 million%. This is not a typo. It sort of is really 10 million, right? So according to the International Monetary Fund, unemployment is upwards of 40%. And this is quite shocking. So minimum wage. So if you were earning minimum wage and you spend every single, I think it's peso on food, you could only afford about 1,000 calories a day, right? So people were literally starving in what was called sort of the Maduro diet. In response, many people have left, well over 10% of the population, mostly into Colombia and other sort of neighboring countries, right? But when it comes to how many people exactly and where exactly and what's their sort of socioeconomic situation, not a lot of good data existed, certainly then. Maybe now it is sort of improved, over the years, because most existing data was based on sort of voluntary self-registration and, misses a lot of groups. And so, okay, what we did in this context, again, we looked at this Facebook data, right? Sort of, so how many people, let's say, who were living in Colombia lived in Venezuela. Okay, let me go a bit slower and try to spell this out. So let's look at only data for the host country of Colombia. So the origin country is always Venezuela, but here's a host country of Colombia. And let's look at sort of this data point here. So this is data we collected in June 2018. This specific data point is just the raw number, right, that you could manually read off the interface of how many Facebook users used to live in Venezuela, but at that time were living in Colombia. Right? So this is this sort of this raw estimate. But as what I sort of mentioned before, not everybody is on Facebook, right? So this is assuming there are no false positives, right? That's of course also an option. But if for now we assume there are no false positives, then this is sort of like a lower bound, right? Sort of the non-Facebook users are basically missing. So we try to correct for this by making a big assumption. And this is just an assumption where we're assuming that the Facebook penetration among the migrants is the same as in the host country. Okay, we've done some other work in other settings, such as in Europe or sort of so, where we have at least some sort of semi-trustworthy data to justify this assumption, but it's still an assumption, right? And so then, if we make this assumption, right, and if we know, okay, in the country of Colombia, maybe 60% of the population is on Facebook, then we are adding the missing 40%, right? So this is the assumption here. This would then give us the sort of this, this upper line of the sort of this interval, right? So this is a very, very, very simple attempt to sort of correct for a penetration. Not perfect, but sort of a step in the right direction. So now, so this is sort of explains these sort of different estimates we get, right? So the gray estimates are for all of Latin America. Now let's compare this with estimates from the United Nations that were collected around the time points that you sort of see here. First, even different UN estimates are sort of inconsistent with each other, sort of so. Right? So this is also quite typical in these sort of these contexts. But they're broadly in line with what sort of Facebook would report, but probably Facebook would lead to an even higher estimate, right? Which is also plausible, right? Again, we don't know for sure. We don't have sort of ultimate ground truth, but it's certainly plausible that these estimates are both on the low end of things. We also work with partners in Colombia to sort of which help to do some sort of attempts, at least validation in Colombia itself. And so here on the right, you see now subnational data collected from Facebook. Again, how many people from Venezuela or lived in Venezuela were at that point living, let's say, here in Norte de Santander. And we compared this with data from the Colombian government that was based on voluntary self-registration. You will see some sort of similarities, but also striking differences, right? Especially away from the border. Data from Facebook would suggest a larger number of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. And now is the question, okay, so who's right? Well, ultimately, we don't know for sure, but at least people on the ground in Venezuela were reporting that probably what we see on the right is closer to the truth, because the sort of the self-registration efforts were more pronounced closer to the border and not as much further inland, sort of. So even though, again, we ultimately don't know who's right, at least people on the ground were telling us this looks more plausible than the sort of the data from the government, right? Which is interesting. We could also do this for other countries where we don't have any data to compare against. I just mentioned Brazil because it was an interesting case. There was at least some presence also further south that we sort of detected, and based on this, UNICEF adjusted the targeting of an online campaign against xenophobia they were running. So there was at least sort of some also operational impact of this analysis. Now, going beyond the raw numbers, we can also try to get a sense of the socio-economic situation of people in different host areas. So let me try to explain this sort of bar chart here. So every bar corresponds to a host country, or in some cases to a host region. So everything's always from Venezuela and in different sort of host countries. Now, let's first just look at the order from left to right. So on the left, you have the area where Facebook users were least likely to use an iOS device. Right? So this is Roraima, Brazil. This is the jungle that people would sort of walk to, right? Like sort of so just across the border. Almost no iOS users were found there. On the other end of this sort of sorting, you have people who made it all the way to the United States, where actually the majority of likely to be Venezuelans were using iOS devices. Right. So this induces the ordering. Now we try to convert this percentage to a Y value, right? Like to a monetary sort of value. How do we do this? Well, we train a separate model that predicts country level per capita GDP using only the percentage of iOS devices among Facebook users in the country, right? So if I tell you, here's the country that has where 60% of Facebook users use iOS devices, you're saying, okay, that's a rich country. Here's a country where only, I don't know, 5% of Facebook users use iOS devices. Okay, that's a poor country. But this sort of rich and poor, you can actually sort of quantify just with a single predictor variable. You can explain almost 90% of the variance in GDP. This model was then applied to these subgroups, right? Basically, sort of mapping these sort of percentages to per capita GDP, right? Now, the precise value, right, I wouldn't necessarily trust, but we've done sort of, we tried different sort of variants of this, and we always came out with these three groups, right, where we would sort of quite comfortably claim that, people who made it only to the neighboring countries, basically mostly walking, such as sort of Colombia or Brazil, they're probably in the worst socioeconomic situation. People who made it a bit further away, right, or possibly by flight or train or some sort of long distance transportation, they're already doing better, right? And people who make it all the way to Spain or the United States, they're kind of least concern in this sort of vulnerability analysis. Again, so we were happy that, again, this had operational impact and continues to be used through this NGO IMAP, who's also working with USAID and who we've sort of, basically taught how to collect and analyze this data. But it's not all rosy. I mean, I also want to point out some of the challenges when doing this data. And this again, we only spotted because we were working with partners and creating sort of data visualizations. So here I'm showing sort of like a temporal trend for Brazil, like some dashboard we had created. And you see that there's this sudden dip, right, where the number actually goes down, right, like sort of in like March of 2019. It seems that there were suddenly fewer people from Venezuela than before. And so, it's okay, was there like return migration or what's going on? No, what was going on there is that actually Facebook changed its algorithm or its sort of classification of how it decides whether somebody used to live in Venezuela. And how do we know? Well, we only know because we observe changes globally, not just for people from Venezuela, but for all types of sort of origin groups, right? Sort of, so it happened globally around the same, plus minus a week or sort of, right? And so this, let's just sort of believe this is, or not just believe, we're pretty certain that this is just a change at sort of in Facebook's black box, right? And again, this sort of shows, the limits, right? There's no warning, right? Nobody tells us. Facebook would not tell us exactly how this works, what they did. We just sort of observe this change in the black box without any prior warning, right? And then we have to sort of correct for this somehow. So that was a bit about how we're doing for time, sort of. So okay, so this was a bit about sort of migration. So I also want to talk a bit more about sort of mapping poverty that I already hinted at a bit with sort of device types. Again, just a bit of motivation. So no poverty is one of the 17 sustainable development goals that, sorry. Yeah, my cough is still the remnant of COVID, if you're wondering. So I'm no longer COVID positive, but I still have a bit of a cough. So, but anyways. So there are different definitions of poverty. Some are monetary, right? So how much money do you earn? There are also others like how much stuff do you have, etc. But here, sort of, one definition looks at monetary income. When you look at sort of the most available data that's existing, it's often 10 years old because it might be linked to a last census. And even when it exists, it's not very granular, sort of. So ideally, you want something at the sort of sub-city level to have more targeted interventions. And so we explored again. So can we use this data from Facebook, such as the device type, or sort of to map poverty, right? And how did we try to evaluate this? So we used ground truth data, also training data, right? Both ground truth and sort of training data from the Demographic and Health Survey. They use a definition of wealth that's asset ownership based. So basically they would survey households and they would ask, do you have running water? Do you have a fridge? Do you have a television? Do you have a motorcycle, etc.? And they would then compile all these answers into a single index using principal component analysis that they call the wealth index. And so a large positive number means people have lots of stuff. Sort of negative number means they don't have a lot of stuff, right? And so this is then the used in a lot of research and analysis as a sort of the as one notion of wealth. So ultimately we try to we want to predict this wealth index, and to predict this we're using different features derived from Facebook. So for example, Facebook's market share, right? So the Facebook penetration, but also things related to the device type, as well as the connectivity. So there's also information about whether people connect using 4G and Wi-Fi, right? And so once we have this, right, once we have sort of ground truth, once we have some sort of features, right, it becomes a standard regression task, right? Sort of, so you can try out your favorite regression model. We tried a couple so what worked best under this configuration were sort of gradient boosting machines. But again, you can sort of try others. There's no innovation happening on this part. So okay, so how well did it sort of work? So let me try to walk you through this table. So first, what would be like a baseline, right? Sort of, so what should we compare against, right? Even without Facebook, you have some knowledge, right? Like sort of, so even if a location has not been surveyed itself, you can look at nearby locations, right? So this here sort of corresponds to baseline, where basically we look at your sort of closest, I think 3 neighbors, but we try different sort of neighbors, and we sort of basically average your closest 3 neighbors to make a prediction for your location. These are then the features that come from Facebook, including Facebook penetration itself, which is also highly predictive. There are other things that relate to sort of population density that also factors in, and then a regional indicator, right? Maybe the poverty dynamics are different in different states. Oh yeah, we did this in India and in the Philippines, I forgot to say, right? Maybe in different Indian states or in different Philippine regions, you have sort of different poverty dynamics. And so, okay, so this is kind of like a baseline, I guess, sort of to compare against, right, where you would just sort of interpolate from other locations. And then if you sort of compare this with Facebook alone, right, so in the case of the Philippines, it improves over this baseline. In India, it actually performs slightly worse, right? And then, as often is the case, if you sort of, throw the kitchen sink at it, you sort of combine everything, so your sort of, overall performance improves. Also, quickly want to mention that there's actually an upper bound because the ground truth is quite noisy, so it's deliberately perturbed to protect privacy of the sort of surveyed households. But this also means that there's sort of like an upper bound in how well you can reproduce it without overfitting. And so compared to this upper bound, right? So in the end, it's sort of maybe 3/4 or maybe sort of 80%, sort of the explainable variance. I think there's an unmuted microphone. Is there a question, or is it just by accident? Okay, I'll just continue for now, but maybe if you could just check that your microphone is muted if you don't have a question. Okay, so this is all jolly good, right? So you get good sort of quantitative results, but then for this sort of work, you actually have to dig a bit deeper, and really look at, well, how well does it really work? Like sort of at the edges, what are the sort of the edge cases, right? One thing that so in machine learning, you would often just drop sparse cases, right? If you don't have enough data for something, just drop it, right? Right? But this, here you don't necessarily want to do, right? So there were some areas where we could just not get any Facebook data, right? There was no signal of any Facebook users whatsoever. So we could not really estimate how many people use whatever iOS devices, right? Because there wasn't any signal to begin with, right? And so those cases were actually dropped for this analysis that I presented, right? So in the case of the Philippines, this was sort of just under 1%, and in India, this was sort of 1% of locations. Sorry to bother you, if you could just mute your mic, so there's just some background noise. Sorry for that. Ruyan, yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you. Okay. And then when we looked at the wealth index, right, of these dropped locations, they were actually below the overall average wealth index, right? So that means that we actually sadly had to drop about 1% of locations, and those were probably poorer than the rest, right? So that's not ideal, but at least we're aware of it. And so we'd have to sort of then think of, okay, in those cases, maybe we use another method, right? For the cases where, we don't have any signal from this. But another dimension that's sort of quite interesting is sort of the demographic disaggregation, right? So here we separately make a prediction for a location only for those Facebook users who have more than a high school degree versus those who don't, right? So so every dot here is a location, one of these surveyed locations for which we have ground truth. The color is basically the population density, how many people are there. Now, this area here are locations where we predict a higher wealth index for those Facebook users with a self-declared university degree, essentially, right? So that's in most locations, you're better off if you have a self-declared university degree, or we predict that you're better off, right? And there are sort of then there may be a few where interestingly the opposite sort of holds, right? And those would be sort of worth investigating, right? What's going on there? But at least the overall trend that we observe, right? So that education level helps is certainly plausible, right? So here we are making like a plausible a prediction. Of course, which would be worth sort of validating in depth using other methods. So this seems to work. But let me show you something that did not work, right? Or at least initially did not work. So we also tried to do gender disaggregated poverty predictions, right? Where we were basically looking at, okay, so what sort of devices are women using? What sort of devices are men using? Let's use that to make a prediction, right? And here you see that it's surprisingly very, very close to the identity line, right? Where where there's very little evidence that women are at any disadvantage, right? But that doesn't seem plausible, right? At least not in the Indian a context, right? So for in other data, for example, from the Global Gender Gap Index, that's something that the World Economic Forum puts out. India, in terms of economic participation and opportunity, would be ranked 149th out of 153 countries considered, right? So certainly, India is not a country of sort of known for gender equality, right? So what's going on here? Right? Why does our model fail and predict basically gender equality in terms of income? So what we see here is a particular type of survivorship bias, right? So it's something also known as Jackie Robinson effect. So Jackie Robinson was the first African-American Major League Baseball player, right? And for him to make it in the Major League, despite all the systematic racism, right? Like, he had to be exceptional, right? Had he been just as good as another white guy, no coach would ever have picked him, right? So if you look at his batting averages, right, he was like an all-star great, right? He had to be, otherwise no chance of succeeding. Something similar is going on in India with women on Facebook. There are only very few women on Facebook, right? So there are far more men than women on Facebook in India, but those that we do see are exceptional, right? They have more likely to use iOS devices, more likely to have university degrees, etc., right? Because again, they need to be, right? Like to make it in a somewhat hostile environment, right? And so this then leads to this sort of fact that, if we extrapolate out from the women that we do see, we think, oh, I mean, all the women we see are doing really well. So, no concerns about gender equality there, right? So if instead of using all features, we only look at Facebook penetration as a single feature, which is also predictive of wealth, but just not quite as good as all the other features combined, then we get a prediction that's more plausible, right? And we would predict that for every single location surveyed, the wealth available to men is sort of higher than the wealth available to women, right? And at least here, the general directionality is at least plausible, right? Maybe precise values are not necessarily. Also here, we were happy that there was at least some tech transfer beyond just the paper So we worked with a small tech company called Thinking Machines, and they incorporated these features in their poverty models together with other features. And these, their poverty predictions were then used by UNDP for their business planning. Let me just check time once more. Okay, so about just over 5 minutes. So I might quickly go over this part. So in essence, we want to monitor internet access gender gaps. Okay, so let me try to show this, so visually. This is joint work with a colleague of mine, QCRI, and at the University of Oxford. So what I'm showing you here at the moment, this is data from the United Nations, from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. So for example, and what we are plotting here is the female to male ratio of internet users, corrected for offline bias in terms there are more women, in the population or something, right? So for example, in Germany, I think there's a value of 0.94 or something, right? Which basically means for every 1 man with internet access, you have 0.94 women with internet access. Okay, so it's not quite gender equal, but it's not too bad, right? And so you see that most of Western Europe and North America and even South America are doing quite well in terms of gender equality, in terms of internet access, right? Now, Africa, not so much, so it depends, but there's a lot of white space, right? Like India is not reporting, even Canada is not reporting or collecting this data to the ITU, right? And so this is another type of gender gaps that we're trying to fill. So now we are using data from Facebook, right? Looking, okay, what's the female to male ratio of Facebook users to then make a prediction for the female to male ratio of internet users, right? And using this model, we managed to fill most of the data gaps, right, that exist, right? And now we would make a prediction for India of 0.64, right? Roughly for every 3 men with internet access, you have 2 women with internet access. Okay, so how well does this model work, right? So for the countries where we have ground truth, we can, we can make predictions and sort of, evaluate, right? Sort of. And so let's look at this online model, which apart from a constant offset has only a single variable, which is this sort of gender gap, which is this ratio of female to male Facebook users, right? With a single variable, right? So a single predictor, we are explaining almost 70% of the sort of variance in this sort of internet access ratio, okay? Just using one variable. Now, traditionally, people would use sort of econometric variables, right? Potentially related to GDP per capita, or from the global gender gap report, there's data on gender gaps in literacy or gender gaps in education. Now this, there was feature selection involved here, so not all features were sort of picked up, but all these others were sort of picked up, and using sort of traditional econometric data, the model actually performed slightly worse and could not make quite as many predictions because some of these features are not as widely available as sort of data from Facebook, right? And if we combine both, then we get a model that's even stronger in terms of their sort of in terms of the model fit. But it's now more limited in terms of number of countries it can make a prediction for, right? Because now we need sort of two data sets, two data sources to be available, right? But as usual, sort of, so if you combine different data sources, typically your model performance improves. And again, this has also been deployed as now part of the SDGs Today, a portal where there are only 3 data sets related to gender gap. 2 come from the UN itself, and 1 is from this project with the University of Oxford. As a recent case study, we've also looked at what's going on, or what has happened in Afghanistan, sort of, right? I mean, I'm sure you're aware of the sort of fall of Kabul and the country to the Taliban, right? And so, what does this mean for internet in general, and what does it mean for women in particular online, right? And there are sort of different sort of storylines, right? Sort of one pointing out to, well, maybe internet access will be restricted, and some people have sort of fled social media, right, out of fear. But then there were also sort of campaigns where women actively used social media, right? Sort of, so for example, this "Do Not Touch My Clothes" campaign in September, right? And so we decided to look at okay, what do we see on Facebook, but not for monthly active users. Everything so far was for monthly active users, but for daily active users. And so this is then a graph that shows sort of daily active Facebook users over time. So here I'm showing the data for Afghanistan, only for teenage women or girls, sort of age 15 to 19. In black, these are the daily active users, the Dow in thousands, just over time. Right? So here, this is just the usual decay. I say usual because among this age group, Facebook is usually losing market share all over the world, right? I mean, to Instagram, sort of, which is still Facebook, and Snapchat and TikTok and sort of others, right? Right? But then this sort of market share decline stopped at the beginning of 2020, and then this is the most interesting bit, right? Sort of, right? So then this is where the fall of Kabul happened, right? Sort of, so there, it's sort of, the Facebook use shot up right before the fall of Kabul. It dropped during the call or around the fall of Kabul. Then it jumped to levels not seen, for many, many years, sort of, or so, when there was this campaign, "Do Not Touch My Clothes." And then there's a sort of leveled off a bit since, right? So at least so far, at least, social media users among young girls seems to have been, if anything, sort of increased to sort of pre-Taliban times, right? Like sort of, so not decreased. The sort of turquoise, blue, greenish line here, this is the female to male ratio, right? It sort of shows that this increase is, that in particular women have increased use, men to a certain degree, but not quite as much, sort of, so that now, at some point, almost 30%, not 30%, sort of 3 to 10 was the ratio of among sort of female to male users, right? Sort of, so whereas in the past it might have been only sort of 2 to 10. This was on the temporal dimension. Also, maybe very quick on the spatial dimension. We're doing this now sort of subnationally for Africa, right? To sort of show you the sort of maps. Let's skip the details. To wrap up, I showed you this sort of the data collection or the type of data and what you can do with it for Facebook. But we've collected data from LinkedIn, Weibo, Snapchat, and Google, right? I mean, they all have advertising platforms like this, and so they must have, this sort of data available, right? It's just so inherent to their sort of business model, right? There's very little that they can do sort of to avoid this, right? You really need these estimates typically for campaign planning, right? Without this, you cannot really plan a successful advertising campaign, right? These estimates are relatively real time. I mean, I think there's a lag of maybe 1 week, even for the so-called daily active users, but even like 1 week lag would essentially still be real time as far as sort of global development is concerned. It's anonymous and aggregate, right? We don't have individual user data. We just have, okay, there are 2,000 users here, or 10,000 users here, right? We don't know who these users are, right? We just have aggregate counts, and there's also certain lower bounds on these counts, right? So Facebook does not report counts below 1,000. I think for LinkedIn, the smallest count you can get is 300, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of attributes that you can use for targeting, and of course, it's free of charge. But of course, it's not all rosy, right? This is all wonderful sort of, right? I already mentioned the whole black box thing, right? We don't know exactly how they infer where somebody has lived, right? Sort of. So we have some ideas, we can discuss those, but ultimately we don't know. We don't know exactly, right? And this black box can also change at any point in time, right? And it has changed, right? As I also sort of showed, right? It's clearly not representative, right? I mean, so first, in the Venezuelan case, we had a trivial correction, but then also in the Indian case, right? You have this sort of only the richest, smartest, most educated, women are on Facebook, right? So you have a very, very biased sample that you get, right? There's also, I mean, it uses a gender dichotomy, right? There's only male or female, right? This does not, include anybody, but everybody, but that's at the moment still what's used in, sadly, what's used in advertising. Users pattern change over time. I mean, so this means even if you have something that, perfectly nowcasts poverty today using Facebook data, I'm sure your model will no longer work 5 years from now, right? Even 2 or 3 years from now, right? As a sort of Facebook users changes, right? You will have to sort of retune your model, right? Sort of. And then that's possible, right? But you have to do that, right? You cannot just assume the model will just, go on working. There's also no historic data available right now. If you come to me after this talk, okay, that's great. I would love to look at, I don't know, something what happened around Brexit or something, or the beginning of COVID. Do you have data? I say, sorry, no, I don't have data, right? Because it's only meant for advertisers who are launching a campaign today, right? There's no sense to launch an advertising campaign, 3 years ago or something. And largely, but not, last but not least, there's a risk of misuse, right? I mean, I showed you where the Nepali are in Doha, okay, fine. But I could have drawn a map of where in Germany people are interested in Jewish holidays, right? Which is, I don't know. I'm German. This makes me a bit uneasy, sort of. Right? And those might not be people of the Jewish faith, or sort of, right? And maybe I don't find anything surprising, right? Maybe it only shows, I don't know, Hamburg, Berlin, and Munich as sort of hotspots. But maybe I do find something, interesting, right? And I mean, the German government is not going to act on this, right? But maybe some other government, right, might, right? And so definitely there's a not a risk of individual harm, but of group harm, right? Again, I cannot identify individuals, but I can identify vulnerable groups. And then, sorry, just to take 2 more minutes of your time. This was all passive, but we're also using the platform actively to actually show an ad, for example, to then recruit people into a survey, or to sort of help with public health measures, such as increased, in this case, this was about sort of breast cancer screening, but just sort of targeted ads. And something that we're interested in is, using sort of on-demand social sensing, using an idea somebody had developed also for sort of Facebook, where, let's say, an earthquake hits a location, then we would, automatically pick a location sort of to target ads in those, locations. We would show an ad that basically show like a sort of like a poll, right? Like sort of, so just like built into Facebook, like a poll sort of. So is the bridge open? Yes, no. Is there an available hospital? Yes, no, right? Like sort of so. And we would sort of aggregate this by location. So this is something we'd like to do. We haven't done. It's related to Facebook safety check that you might be aware of, but it's far more flexible, right? We can really ask about sort of infrastructure being accessible rather than just if people are okay or not. And my last slide, I promise. what's the sort of motivation out of this, right? The motivation is all, okay, better data leads to better decisions, right? But that's of course not necessarily true, right? It's not about, we need more data, we need more computational scientists and all this, right? Now, well, we've had data about global warming for decades and the world's still not acting, right? And so when I end a bit on a sort of maybe questioning my own work in a sense, right? So again, like all this better data can only help to some degree, right? To help at least highlight systematic issues, but of course, just having more data will not fix those issues, right? We really need the social sciences and people who know more about how decisions are made, right? To then hopefully use this data for better decision making. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Ingmar, for all the information about the fascinating source of data. Question. I see Pushkal's hand raised.
I can allow other people if they want to go first for the questions.
Go for it. You're the only hand
Okay,
up.
cool. So Ingmar, like a couple of questions. One is like, and this is more from like engineering side. So is there like a rate limit or something? Like, because you mentioned that it's a challenge to get the data, but it's like a rate limit for the API.
Yeah, there isn't a rate limit. It depends on the different tiers, but the most restrictive rate limit is one request every 10 seconds for Facebook.
I see. And the other thing is like, you did not mention about like, is it in like Python or R or like what kind of code or backend you're using?
Sure. Feel free to email me. I'll send you pointed to the library we are using. We are using Python, but it's all based on Facebook's Graph API, right? So if you just Google Facebook's Graph API, there's well documented, sort of standard web API, right? So you can write your client in any language you want. It's just a REST API.
Yeah. So elaborating on that, I think I saw that Python like a couple of years ago, and then I was interested in building like for R because like social scientists are more like used to of doing R. So if we can like create a equal wrapper, and maybe if I get time, I can also help in that.
I will send you also pointed to an R library. I'm not sure if that's as actively maintained, but certainly I think Sophie Gill, I think is her name, or Gill at Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research has written an R library for social scientists. So she's a demographer, So I would send you both pointers if you send me, or if others want to send me an email, I'd be happy to send you pointers to the code.
Sure. And the final thing is like, are you also working on some recent like data sets, like say COVID, like understanding how people are interested in ordering like COVID kits, depending on how the cases are being infected in places, something like that?
Not for this data set. I mean, we have other COVID-related things, but not for this. Others have though used the advertising platform to actually survey people about COVID. Okay, this actually we have also done to a certain degree, just asking people, what do you know about COVID, right? How does it spread or right? But not something more, I don't know, epidemiology modeling or something. So just asking people about things.
Okay, yeah, completely makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
So any other questions from anyone? I see one from Federico.
Yes, hi, hopefully you can hear me. Thanks for the talk, it was really, really interesting. I just have a very kind of small technical question in a way, because you mentioned about how different platforms have, I guess, different numbers, kind of thresholds below which they don't give you the number, like Facebook, 1,000 people and so on. Is there something similar kind of at a geographical level? So, is there some kind of minimum geographical area that they give you, and you have an idea of like roughly how small or big that is?
Yeah, so it depends between platforms, but in the case of Facebook, so for countries that use zip codes, or at least for most countries, certainly for the US and UK, you can target based on zip code. Or alternatively, if there is no zip code or you don't want to use zip codes, you can drop a pin with a 1 kilometer radius, so 2 kilometer diameter. Having said that, the location inference is a bit noisy. So we did an experiment where we basically sort of ran, like pins into the sea, like in Boston and Barcelona, right, where nobody should be living, in the sea itself. And, even like a couple of 100 meters, where maybe up to like a kilometer away from the sea, there were still signal of people living there, right? So effectively, it's a bit sort of noisier, maybe 4 or 5 kilometer diameter with some fuzzy boundaries around. But yeah, that's sort of the smallest area.
Thank you.
So I had a kind of a follow-up question there. So because you've got these differences across platforms, and maybe even the different platforms have their different strengths and weaknesses, right? So for example, I would expect education to be better filled in as a field in LinkedIn rather than on Facebook. So I don't know if there's, if you've done a comparison of the strengths and weaknesses of different platforms, and also can you merge across platforms? That would be super cool if you could do that.
So as far as merging is concerned, we've done this a bit for example, mapping internet access, gender gaps, where we also use data from Google in particular, where it had broadly very similar trends, just in terms of, you know, the gender disaggregated users. And if you combine them, you get a slight boost, but not much boost. And if I had to pick one, Facebook itself was actually more predictive for sort of internet access gender gaps. Other things where we have done a more sort of bit comparison was for teenagers in particular. So work with UNICEF looked at teenage internet access gender gaps in particular, right? And for teenagers, Facebook itself is probably not the most relevant platform, as we were sort of saying, right? So there we were using also data from Instagram and Snapchat, right? And they mostly go in a similar direction, but not always. I don't know, I think it was Japan that had some weird outlier in terms of sort of, I don't remember which one, but there was a certain country-specific effect, right? Where there's in this one country, this one platform is really big among this one demographic subgroup for some reason, right? And so that's sort of something that we observed there. Apart from that, yeah, I mean, for other research questions, we would, let's say, only use LinkedIn, right? So we've done work looking at sort of high-skilled migration, like how many people studied in Germany and now work in the UK, or how many people, whatever, the other way around or something. And for that, we would use data from LinkedIn, right, where we sort of think, okay, this sort of the highly skilled are probably on LinkedIn, and put information on where they studied or something.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end of this seminar, and I'm happy to stay on. I don't know, Ingmar, if you will have.
I have a few more minutes. I'd be happy to chat more. Just if there are comments, questions.
Yeah, but I wanted to give a chance to people in case there are any news or anything, because it's been a while since we had these seminars, and I think Susan, was it you who mentioned that you had a summer school or something, or a winter school that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks very much first for the talk. Very interesting. Yeah, I'll just put it in the chat. It's a link to a spring school on computational communication methods. So I'll put that in the chat window. But thanks very much for the talk.
Fantastic. Any other questions from anyone while we still have Ingmar here? Federico, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to take
No,
time
please.
for someone. I mean, mine is more of, I guess, like a more philosophical question in a way, in the sense that I'm quite interested in, well, I'm very interested in this work in my research as well. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is how this, I guess, broadly speaking, this kind of work can be used for kind of, policy, let's say, and government and so on. But it kind of doubt that I always have in my mind that I can't really resolve is how realistic is it to actually use it kind of long term? Because policies often are quite long term projects. And as you said, users change, platforms change over time. In 10 years' time, who knows if Facebook and Instagram will still be around and so on. And so on the one hand, I guess, it's kind of half the point of my research is like, oh, actually, can we use this for policy? But then on the other hand, I'm like, does it actually make sense to try and use these things for policy? Because a lot of policies are trying to address problems which are quite long-term. And so I can't quite reconcile it in my own head. So I just thought if you had a view on that.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So as you say, I mean, I would never ever recommend, oh, this will work for the next 10 years. So as you say, right, it almost surely will not. At least not as it is, right? Will something like this still work in 10 years? Probably, right? It works at a fairly low level, right? Some sort of advertising that provides some sort of aggregate data, for planning. I don't see that going away anytime soon, right? At that level, And the other thing is, I mean, a lot of our use cases are indeed more driven by sort of semi-humanitarian purposes, like sort of so, right, where you'd like to know something soon, right, and you sort of so, and where, let's say, hopefully 10 years from now nobody will talk about Venezuela anymore, right? So then done, sort of so, right? Or in the case of sort of gender gaps, hopefully we'll have other data collection mechanisms in 3-4 years, right? So we don't need this hacky approach for this, right? So hopefully countries will, like Canada, for, I don't know, crying out loud, I don't know, it's not reporting this data, right? Like I don't know, right? I mean, or South Africa, right? I mean, clearly they could and they should, right? Like sort of, right? So hopefully this will not be easy, right? But at the moment, just to raise awareness of this issue and have some sort of data, it's hopefully helpful, right? Just to illustrate how bad the situation is. So yeah, it is a good question, right? If the policy question is really relying on having consistent data, right? Also consistent, right? The consistency, right? Comparable across many years, then this is probably not it, sort of, right? Like even if the data is, it will be hard to compare and sort of normalize across many years.
Thank you. Yeah, that's kind of, I think, kind of the point of view that I'm converging towards as well. It's more like shorter term, kind of rapid ways of measuring something right now, but not knowing, in the kind of longer term. Thank you.
And there's a specific space for that as well, right? So if there's like a mass migration which has happened, like in the case of Venezuela or something, it's pretty hard to get the data for that in time. Whereas you can maybe take some actions when disasters happen or some things like that, where you can't collect data. It's quite useful. Okay, so it's 2 minutes past the hour. Unless there are other final questions, we can maybe thank Ingmar for his time. So thanks, Ingmar, so look forward to catching up with you soon.
Yeah, thanks all. And again, don't hesitate to send me an email, if you want pointers to code or something or sort of, so happy to help, get you started.